hopefully the sound works. This is an experiment. I'd like to begin a conversation, but ask some other folks to put their ideas and sort of nuggets of how they look at these conditions on the table as well. Let's start with David Hale.
Well, I think it's very clear that we have had since July an evolving financial crisis here in the United States, which, because of the securitization process, has now encompassed financial institutions in Europe, in Australia, all over the world. At the core of the problem is the subprime money excesses that occurred in this country over the last 3 or 4 years. This very large stock of debt, $1.3 trillion, of which the default rate will ultimately peak, probably somewhere in the range of 20 or 25%. About 70% of this debt is securitized, so we don't actually know who owns it right now. It's not like the S&L crisis 15 years ago, where the government would go in and examine the bank and see the bad loans and make adjustments for it. These securities are owned all over the world. This is why 2 German banks had a major crisis this summer. The Germans have a shrinking population. They've had no housing inflation for 15 years because they have no mortgage loans to make in Germany. They buy U.S. subprime loans. And the result was 2 of their banks got in very serious trouble. One is now gone, the Landesbank is active, and the other has to be rescued before capital injections by its parent over the next few weeks. On Wall Street, we've had big losses announced here in the last few weeks by Citibank and Merrill Lynch. The reality is we don't know what the ultimate losses will be. We have 3 categories of accounting for these securities under the new S 157 rule. There's a category called Level 3, which includes securities that are highly liquid, don't have good market prices, and therefore the investment banks and commercial banks are allowed to value them based on models. But as we approach the end of the year, I'm sure accountants will demand there be some better attempt to reflect what these securities prices would reflect in the market today. And the market values on subprime paper are appalling. On triple B, you can buy the loans for 18 cents on the dollar, and for AAA, that's 68 cents on the dollar. There are probably tens of billions of dollars of new losses to come over the next 3 or 4 months on Wall Street firms, hedge funds, and so on. We probably won't know until January, February, the accountants got into this. So there's more damage to be done. A few days ago, Citibank had to raise capital, several $billions by going to a sovereign wealth fund in the Persian Gulf and selling securities with a yield of 11%. That's extraordinary for Citibank. Indeed, its equity on the New York Stock Exchange is yielding close to 7%. That's also remarkable, but to have to pay 11% new capital for what is America's largest financial institution is truly extraordinary. This is the kind of yield you'd expect from a bank in Nigeria or a bank in Kazakhstan, not the leading financial institution in New York City. So we have a long ways to go before we're out of this crisis. The Federal Reserve has begun to respond. We've had 2 interest rate cuts. I'm sorry Randy Koser couldn't come today. He made a speech last week because there would be no more rate cuts. But Ben Bernanke last night made a speech suggesting the issue is still wide open. And the fact is the Fed has lagged in this crisis because they didn't see it coming. Back in April and May, Bernanke was making lots of speeches, reassuring us the losses might be $50 or $100 billion. There wouldn't be any contagion effects. So the Bear Stearns hedge funds went bankrupt in June, and the market began to realize the scope of the problem. We then, of course, had inflation in the commercial paper market. We had true contagion. And then rushed to catch up. But the fact is, despite his great knowledge of economic history, he was slow. And one remarkable commentary on this is some data I got last week from Roger Kabarich, the chief economist of Union Credit Bank in New York. Under the Freedom of Information Act, he was able to get access last month to Ben Bernanke's phone records. And the phone records indicate that in the month of August, Ben Bernanke called Hank Paulson 85 times. Why was he calling Hank Paulson 85 times? The answer is very simple. Hank Paulson could explain the crisis to him because Hank Paulson helped create it. So we had Hank Paulson explaining to Ben Bernanke what those changes in market value meant, what a CDO is, and why this was turning into a very, very significant crisis. But one bit of good news is in today's Wall Street Journal. It appears the administration, working with some major banks like Countrywide, Wells Fargo, is going to try and get a debt adjustment for the 2 million people whose mortgages reset on their variable rate loans in the year ahead. And if Wells Fargo and Countrywide and other groups can basically freeze these mortgage rates for the next 1 or 2 years, not have the core rate go from 5 to 8, 9, 10, or 11, the default rate will be held in check. Because if we don't have this kind of change, if we don't prevent a reset of these mortgage rates, that subprime default rate could increase very, very significantly over the next several months. But the fact is we have several $100 billion of loans being reset next year. So this is, I think, the first what I call really good policy response. The fact is the Fed can't solve this problem. This problem already exists. It's evolving. All the Fed can do is try and contain the damage in the financial markets by easing. And they've begun to do that. But if we can, in fact, address the core problem, why these mortgages are defaulting or about to default, that will, I think, be a very important first step in trying to contain the magnitude of the crisis.
Thank you very much, David. As Bernard Schwartz said today, if our timing is great on when we've held this conference, Zachary Karabell's timing is even better with having the lead op-ed in the journal today. But Zachary, you're up next.
Well, I think I'm going to strike a somewhat different note than my friend David did. In the same time that all this has unfolded, Apple has sold 1.5 million iPhones at a price point anywhere between $300 and $599 per phone. And for those of you who bought the $599 phone, I'm terribly sorry. So that's somewhere in the area of $1 billion of iPhone sales, not accounting all the other Macintosh and assorted iPods and iPod Nanos and everything else that I'm sure 2/3 of the audience are currently holding or listening to. Now, the iPhone is not a subprime product, or at least one would hope that it's not a subprime product, because presumably if your rate's about to reset from 5 to 8%, spending $600 on an iPhone is probably not the wisest allocation of your personal capital, but of course doesn't preclude people from doing it. But on the whole, it's targeted to a very different area of the economy than the current area of the economy that we're focusing on. And the point of that is really to say that this idea that we're living in this thing called an economy that has a unitary number called a GDP figure and this thing called the consumer that spends X, which grows or contracts on a monthly basis, has always been something of a statistical fiction, but I don't think at any point until now has it been so glaringly at odds with the lived reality of multiple segments of the economy. And what I mean by that is that there is no thing called the U.S. economy, and there is no figure that captures it. There are multiple economies existing in juxtaposition to each other. Added to this three-dimensional chess game, there's a global economy, which, as we know, is interacting with it in much more complicated ways. And of course, I'm always impressed with David knows the names of banks in Germany. But we do live in an extremely, it's very trite to say this, complicated world. But it's not just that the world is complicated, it's that the statistical universe and benchmarks that we use to claim an understanding of it are either misleading to the point of being false or simply cannot capture what's going on in the system. And I think that's one of the reasons why, time and again over the past several years, expected outcomes simply do not happen the way they are expected, which doesn't mean that good things are happening. And I also think it's a mistake to say, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the economy? Because the next response to that should be a question of, whose economy did you have in mind? The economy, I venture to say, of the people in this room, is not just doing just fine, but it's doing rather well. If we were sitting in Silicon Valley right now and we were to have a conclave, the economy in Silicon Valley or in parts of Austin are quite good. The economy 60 miles to their east is not good at all, and they are living in completely different universes. The problem on the one hand of extrapolating economic effects from the meltdown of the subprime space is that the people who are in the subprime space and were granted easy credit are not the people who are fueling the economic growth in the United States. That is not a partisan comment, and it has immense social issues, but it is still as much a lived reality as anything we can point to. The elements of this economy that are suffering are doing badly, unequivocally, and have been progressively doing badly over the past number of years. The parts of this economy that have been doing spectacularly well are continuing to do well, albeit some elements of them will take a hit in the coming months because of this huge exposure, as David mentioned, of the financial space to this particular part of the housing space. But then you do need to add the global dimension. And what is truly fascinating, even with an 11% yield, about the sovereign wealth fund and the Abu Dhabi deal for Citi is that there is immense liquidity in the world, it's just not here. And the degree to which we're not either prepared or comfortable for that fact. I mean, there is an analogy to be made of if the last 20 or 30 years of the 20th century represented a movement of labor and manufacturing away from the traditional Western world and into the emerging world, the benefits which the emerging world are now reaping and reaping in spades, this period of time could well see a similar shift in the global capital world, away from its centrality in the United States and toward multiple other points. Anyone who wants to show up in the middle of Dubai or Abu Dhabi these days will realize that part of the appeal of those places is that they make Switzerland look like an invasive place to have your assets. So, the degree to which capital is moving to where it wishes to move rather than where we wish it to move is part of the fact of the system that the United States, in part, has been central in creating, but seems increasingly uncomfortable with the implications of. Again, the social and political issues that this creates domestically are unequivocal and are things that we're obviously going to be grappling with in a political and electoral way. But the implications for this as a systemic reality are very different. We are living in a global economic system. Our ability to capture, moderate, determine is increasingly getting beyond us. We still maintain, otherwise there wouldn't be such focus, something of an illusion that if the Federal Reserve makes the right decisions or the wrong decisions, the economy, this statistical fiction, is going to move in a particular direction, either good or bad. We haven't yet potentially grappled with the fact that it may not matter nearly as much as we think whether or not the Fed makes the right decisions or the wrong decisions, because the ability of that central bank to manifestly affect these things over the long term is much less than our current conception of them holds. Now again, this is not an optimistic portrayal of what's going on domestically, but it is a stable portrayal of what's going on within this global economic system. And one final comment on this, and I can speak from this from the perspective of part of what I do is also serve as a money manager for Fred Alger Management. And it is very bizarre for many of us to have had a year where, for some of what happens on Wall Street, where the actual returns have been so good, but the climate has been so bad. I mean, basically, if you looked at the climate today, you would think that things are absolutely atrocious, that this was like 2002, that things were really falling down. And certainly some of that fear may be anticipatory, and no one can ever prove. The great thing about forecasting Armageddon is that unless you give a date, no one can ever prove you wrong. So, there's no way to say to somebody who's about to tell you that soon enough this will all collapse. That is a delightfully unfalsifiable statement. And it exists out there as a possibility. But we're also juxtaposed to the fact that there's an inverse relationship between the kind of stability of the system and both the discomfort and fear that attends it. And I think a lot of that discomfort and fear, or at least some of it, has to do with the growing recognition that we don't really fully understand what's going on, nor do we have the tools or the means to measure it, and therefore nor are we able to always make meaningful policy decisions, either economic or political, in such a way that it shapes this system as we wish it to be shaped. And I think this is going to get worse, not better. That the gap between our sense of and our desire for control and the reality of the system we're living in is going to widen and not narrow, and that this is going to have some troublesome consequences. But we need to keep in mind that there is no one economy, and that iPhone economy and the subprime economy are sitting together within this country, and that our economy and China's and the Gulf regions are sitting together in this world, and that they are forming a system, whether we like it or not a particularly coherent one, but a system that we're only beginning to fully recognize.
James Galbraith has joined us from Austin and is the author of a paper that we put out. We've added this to Zach Karabell's Wall Street Journal op-ed as well, but the macroeconomic considerations of a public investment strategy is with you. And so Jamie Galbraith up now.
Let me comment on the crisis that broke out. Serve as a referee. I think it's quite true that there are offsetting factors in the present economy, particularly with the dollar having come down. With the dollar having come down, exports are up. So far, the growth rate has held up, and employment has not yet started to deteriorate. But I still think that David's pessimism has the better part of this argument, and let me explain why. David laid out in rather gripping detail the extent to which the subprime mortgage crisis has still got to unfold. The degree to which it's unfolding not only in the financial system, but also on the ground in the housing market in American communities. We're looking at initial filings for foreclosures, which are running at the rate of 1 Hurricane Katrina per month, and a total projection of perhaps 10 times the effect of that displacement. But that is not the end of the story, because these are homes, families in homes which are located in neighborhoods. And the decline in the ability of these families to service their mortgages will affect not only the value of their houses, but the value of their neighbors' houses, including many people who do not have subprime mortgages, who have standard mortgages, or whose homes equity has been the basis of the valuation supporting home equity loans. And so we are looking at what has been, for the last decade, a major source not only of the housing sector overall as a component of the economy, but also of support for household consumption spending. So it does seem to me that there is a direct connection between the housing economy and the iPhone economy, and the consequences of the slump in the housing sector will unfold well beyond the immediate impact on low-income families who took out subprime mortgages that are now in the process of resetting. The difficulty of a housing slump, I've had a peripheral involvement in credit cycles now since the New York City financial crisis in 1975, 1976, and going through the Chrysler bailout, the Hunt silver debacle, the third world debt crisis, the Asian crisis, the Russian crisis, the tech bust. The difficulty of a housing-based credit crunch is somewhat special in two respects. One, it is very, very broad-based. It's spread out over the entire country. It is not situated in a single commodity or in a single region, as to a certain degree at least, the tech boom was. And secondly, unlike a credit cycle in manufacturing, the inventory does not immediately or even soon go away in a housing bust. The houses stay there, they stay in the neighborhoods, they decay, and they act as a barrier onto the rise in the valuation, the recovery of the valuations of the remaining houses. And that is a phenomenon which can continue for quite a long time. We had this regionally in Texas, where I lived 20 years ago, and it took at least 7 years or so for us to recover. So even if it's true, which it is, that housing is only a part and not by itself all that massive a part of U.S. GDP, it is still true that a slump in housing could have an effect on our ability to grow, which is quite sustained and long duration. In other words, it's going to face us with a problem that we're going to have to continue to deal with for quite a long time to come. David, I think, made a very good suggestion, which is that as a preliminary step here, we ought to be taking steps to keep people in their homes. And that means slowing down the process by which people get evicted, permitting them, maybe installing off the resets of the mortgages, permitting a workout process to take place so that we can distinguish the cases of victimization from cases of fraud, and to the extent possible, ward off the neighborhood effects, the generalized tendency of these problems to spread from one house to the next and from one neighborhood to the next. So that's, I think, part of what needs to be done as a solution. Let me talk about two aspects of this that I think are also quite closely connected. One is the current situation of the dollar. It was said earlier that the dollar is still strong. That is not the way it looks to me. And I think evaluating the strength of the dollar on the basis of the U.S. current account is not if that was indeed what was at the foundation of that comment, is not entirely appropriate for the currency that's serving as the world's currency reserve. Because the issue here, we will run a current account as long as the rest of the world wishes to add to its dollar reserves. The problem here is not one of our trade balance, but one of the attitude of the world financial community toward their holdings of dollar assets as compared to other assets. And if a downturn in the dollar gains sufficient momentum, goes into a mode of overshooting, we could run into a situation in which we run into a fundamental problem of the stability of that foundation of the world monetary system on which we have relied for at least the last 20, maybe the last 30 years. And that seems to me a risk that should be avoided. The dollar has been falling in part because the U.S. economy has been in decline, is in decline, and is perceived to face the risk of an even more serious decline in the immediate future. The key to maintaining the existing system, which is very much not only in our interest, but also in the interest of the larger world community, is an expectation that there will be a recovery, that there will be a rebound, that the dollar is a good long-term asset, and that the United States remains the best choice in the world's community as the anchor for the global financial system. We need to give the world a basis for believing that. And that interacts with the comment I was just making about the durability of a housing-based slump. If we do not act to take care of this problem, we may move into a situation where we simply don't have the expectation of a near or medium-term recovery. And that could cause us problems, not only at home, it would certainly cause immense political problems and social problems, but also fundamentally affecting the position of the United States in the global financial system. Something we should avoid, and I think we can avoid. How? Well, we have to create a basis for a new round of economic growth and a new round of American economic leadership, which is exactly what we did do in the 1990s. That was essentially the foundation of the technology boom, which brought capital that was fleeing Asia after 1997, capital that was fleeing Russia after 1998, brought it to this country because we were the place where it was happening, where these products were being designed, where these inventions were being made, where the future of the world economy was in effect being created in Silicon Valley and in other parts of this country, and basically nowhere else. We could, if we put our minds to it, do that again, but I believe, and this gets me back to the point that Bernard was making in his opening remarks, that the foundation of that effort in our current conditions has to rest on a revival and a recovery of our capacity to rebuild our infrastructure, to build the public investment. That will be the foundation, it seems to me, for meeting the economic needs not only here, but also in the world over the next generation. We have a vast energy problem. It is a problem of our national dependence on foreign sources of oil. It is a problem of our carbon dioxide emissions. It is a problem of climate change. It's not only a problem facing us, it's a problem facing the entire world. And it's fair to say that the rest of the world, I believe, understands this problem and is much more alarmed about this problem and much more ready to move on this problem than we have been. But we still are the key country because we have the capacity to do the research, to do the design, to do the engineering. And we are the major emitters. So we also have the capacity to make the most progress in reducing our emissions in a way which is compatible with maintaining a high standard of living. If we do that, we put together the institutions and the mechanisms that make it possible for us to do this over 10, 15, 20, 25 years, then it seems to me we can solve, in a sense, both of these problems. We can not only close the infrastructure gap, the deficit of which Bernard spoke, but we can also create the conditions under which the United States economy remains the key economy for the world financial system. And that is something which, if we do it right, could avoid a period of instability, a period of transition, which by itself would be enormously costly for the world economy. It might well not be managed at all, might well plunge us back into a kind of global state of chaos and incoherence, such as we experienced between the two world wars. We should not want that. I don't think anybody, not the Chinese, not the Europeans, not the Saudis, nobody really wants this to happen. But the risk is there, and in part, our responsibility is to conduct ourselves both domestically and internationally so as to minimize the effect of preventing from happening. And basically to keep the current system going and to continue to solve problems in the framework of that system.
Thank you. I should mention, before we move to Steve Perlstein, that for those of you in the C-SPAN audience and those of you here today, we will put on our website under this event at newamerica.net the related materials. We're going to add Simon's blog. We'll add a link to Zach Karabell's op-ed today in the Wall Street Journal, but also Jamie Galbraith and the other reports that we've had today. But one of the things I'm very pleased with Steve Perlstein is so often writing about the economic street. Today he literally did in Silver Spring, Maryland, in his column. I'll recommend to those who can to check out Steve Perlstein's column today about music in the street in Silver Spring. Not quite the street we're going to talk about today, but I wanted to introduce Steve Perlstein next.
Thank you. I should first warn you that I'm the only one here on the dais who does not have a PhD in economics.
Actually, I don't have a PhD in economics. I have a PhD. But everyone assumes that I do. And I thought, just to be fair, I should acknowledge that I don't.
He's actually in street music.
Yeah.
So I'm not an economist. I just play one on television. I think to some degree I disagree and agree with a lot of things that I won't go into generally. I think I'd like to frame things a little differently. Normally I tend to look at things in a micro way. I tend to look at what's going on in the business sector and figure out what's going on in the economy based on that. And it's actually a technique that served me pretty well as a journalist for a long time. I'm not in that frame of mind right now. And I, by the way, used to be very suspicious, and I am very suspicious of sort of all these conversations about macroeconomics and current account deficits and monetary policy. I think this is one of those times, however, where we ought to pay attention to that. This is not a problem of subprime mortgages. It is not a mortgage problem. And if there are things that we need to do about that and focus on that, that's important. But I think one of the things we have to understand here is that we have had major macroeconomic imbalances for a long time. And those have caused dislocations and mispricing all through the world's economy. We had a credit bubble here. We did not have a mortgage bubble. We didn't have a real estate bubble. We had a credit bubble of an enormous proportion. And they've created all sorts of asset bubbles. Home prices are one of them, but we had a takeover bubble, we had an art bubble, we've had a commercial real estate bubble, we have a bubble in India on real estate and stocks, we surely have a bubble in China, we have a bubble in Russia, again, asset bubble. Some of these have burst, and some of them have not burst, but they will burst. And so to think about this as a subprime problem, I think misses the point. These bubbles are the result of this big macroeconomic imbalances. And I'm the worst person on this dais, or the last person you're going to want to hear about why that happened. But basically, there were a lot of dollars in other people's hands, and they wanted to lend them back to us. And to other people, and it caused us to invest in things in unproductive ways. You're going to hear the next thing about productive investment. We have just spent the last 10 years misinvesting trillions and trillions of dollars, bidding up the price of assets that were not worth it. And now we have to bring the price of those assets back down. And they will come down whether we want them to or not, because that's the way markets work. That's a good thing. But it's not going to be painless. And in fact, we want it to happen. We don't want to prevent it from happening. You might want to have it happen in an orderly way, may want to cushion the blow of people who are least able to absorb that pain, but we want it to happen. We will have a bursting of the commercial real estate bubble, 15% minimum. We are in the midst of a residential real estate bubble. Prices will come down 15%. This is a tremendous amount of money. We had the biggest takeover boom anyone has ever seen. People overpaid the companies, and they did so, by the way, with credit. Now that credit and the equity has to come down. The stock market is not what to look at here. The stock market was not the biggest bubble. It's collateral damage in this, and you're making a mistake to focus on the stock market. The credit market, which David talked about today, 18 cents on D tranches, 68 cents on AAA tranches. That's the market to focus on. Now, we haven't talked about the Fed, except to say that Zach said that they're less important than they used to be. There's not much they can, and there's less they can do to control this. I would agree with that. In my own opinion, I think it's a real mistake for them to use interest rate policy as a way to solve this problem. They have a lot of tools at their disposal. If there is a liquidity problem in certain markets, and there is, they have tools to deal with that. They can make loans to people on very easy terms when they need to. They can print as much money as they want, and they should do that. And if you read Don Cohn's speech earlier this week, his focus was on that. He said, we're on the case, and we will do what we need to do to keep liquidity in the financial system. And central bank here and everywhere else are working on that. They're doing a pretty good job of it, and they should continue to do it. But it would be a mistake for the Fed. Just let out the word that we are going to use our monetary policy, our interest rate policy, to try to stop the process by which the air is let out of these bubbles. Because it needs to get let out. And if you try to delay that, you will wind up like Japan with a decade of very slow growth. We are going to have a period of slow growth because of this, and we are going to have a period in which our standard of living declines. Why is it going to decline? It's a simple macroeconomic observation. We have been living beyond our means. And if you want to go from living beyond your means to living at your means, you have to reduce your standard of living collectively. It's going to be very uneven, but collectively we have to do that. And we're going to do it either by having slower growth than we otherwise would have had. Notice that's a hedge. That's the economist's hedge. That's not, I'm not telling you what the growth rate is, but it's probably going to be pretty slow for a number of years, 2 or 3. But we're also going to take it in the form of inflation. That's probably where we're going to take it. And what the Fed has to do now is figure out the best combination of whether we're going to take it in inflation or slower growth, but we're going to take it. And there's distributional consequences to which way you do it, and there's consequences for the financial system that has a dynamic of its own that you want to be careful about. But that's their task. That's why it's an unenviable task at this point. That's why they're in a no-win situation. They lower the rates, you're going to get inflation, you're going to get a dollar problem. If you raise rates, you're going to get a slow economy problem. And you're going to get some other financial problems with financial institutions. There's something else the Fed can do, which is actually mentioned here today, which is that the pricing of the securities, and it's not just mortgage securities now, it's all those loans for takeovers, commercial real estate loans. Those loans, how they're priced for annual and quarterly accounting purposes, turns out to now be a very important issue. Because institutions have to mark these to market. They have to say what they're worth now. And that's really a lot of guesswork. But if they are forced to value them at ridiculously low prices, 18 cents on the dollar, 68 cents on the dollar of debt, that's going to make the situation worse. And in a regulatory way, the Fed could help with that, along with the SEC. They could get together and come up with the accounting firms with some a template or some rules, and this is well beyond my ability to talk about it, but so that they don't have to be marked to what was the last sale of those instruments in a highly illiquid market, which was very low. That would take a lot of pressure off the financial system. That would do a lot more and directly go to the problem than trying to reflate the balance sheets of banks by lowering interest rates and trying to reflate bubbles that we shouldn't be trying to reflate. So there are other things the Fed can do besides just lowering the federal funds rate, which, by the way, is not doing a very good job right now at moving all other sorts of rates. Rates for people other than the federal government are going up, as they probably should. And so there's some comment now that the Fed is fighting the markets. Look how low interest rates are for two months or 3 months or 3 years. The Fed is behind the curve. It's got to get its rates down so that the yield curve is steeper and it's more in line with what it should traditionally be. But if you look at the yield curve for AAA borrowers, it's actually pretty right. So don't be misled by yield curves now about Treasury issues. Treasury issues are in short supply now because there's a lot of people who don't know what to do with their money and they decided to buy Treasuries. It drives the price of the Treasuries up and the yields down. And that's a supply and demand, short-term supply and demand situation in a limited market right now, and we shouldn't read too much from that. It's not about inflation expectations. It's not about the cost of money to anyone other than the federal government. You made a comment. I wanted to make one final comment about investment. I'm sure we are underinvesting in things like infrastructure, things like research. But there's going to be a conversation later about, well, we have this deficit in investment in the government, and we need to do something about that right away. Okay, I can live with that. And we shouldn't worry about running up the federal deficit in doing so. I would like to suggest to you that for those of us who don't believe in supply-side economics and don't believe that tax cuts pay for themselves, please let's not fall into the trap of saying investment spending pays for itself. Infrastructure investment pays for itself. Over the very long run, it might, but that's over the really long run. Right now, we have a situation here, to return to my original point, where we are living beyond our means. When we say we, that's households, businesses, and the government. Businesses are not living beyond their means. So that is households. In fact, businesses are actually saving. So households and government are living beyond their means. And the idea that the solution to this problem is for us to live beyond our means more seems to me crazy. Are there things that we could cut in the federal government and shift that spending to infrastructure? You bet. There's a war, there's silly spending, if you're talking about Bernard, there's silly spending on some weapon systems in the Cold War that we don't need. There's farm subsidies. I could go on and on and on. There's plenty of money. We're wasting lots of money on health care with very little payoff. So there's plenty of money there to invest better. But the idea that what we should do, the government should do now is go out and borrow a lot, I think is a very bad mistake. So I would only add to say that I know I sound like a pessimist here. I'd like to frame it differently, which is I am very optimistic that we can get the air out of these bubbles if we let the markets do their work and understand that we need to pay for our extravagance of the last 20 years. And then after that, we do have the strongest economy in the world. We have the most competitive and innovative business sector in the world, and we'll do fine. But if we try to delay that day, I think all we will do is simply spread out and increase the pain that we're going to have to suffer.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all the panelists. We have a couple of two fingers already from other panelists, and we want to offer 2-minute nobody can comment on this, but Simon was first, and then we'll go to Zach and David and then to Jamie.
I just wanted to pick on something Steve said and point out that a very interesting parallel between his main argument that there is an imbalance of savings and investment around the world, and the way in which these flows have occurred, that's the real issue here. There's a very interesting parallel to that argument and an argument made by Mervyn King, who was the governor of the Bank of England.
Well, this is going to be a compliment. You're not going to blame me. You're not going to blame me for the failure of the bank, are you?
Mervyn King has a speech he made in Belfast in October, and it's on their website. You might want to put a link. In which he says, apropos Northern Rock, and what has happened, the asset prices, there's some very proximate issues in the UK. There's also a global issue. And there's also a worry. I think Steve is telling you should pay attention to these big world issues. It is true there's a lot of savings in the world that has been happy to invest in the United States. And much of that I think will continue. But the way in which it flows into the United States will may not be flowing elsewhere. The way in which it might feed into asset bubbles and other situations now, I think that's my major concern to emerging markets going forward. I think that they can very much go through exactly the same sort of cycle as Steve described, rather eloquently as the US.
Zach,
Where to begin? First of all, Jamie Galbraith, I appreciate you playing the neutral referee, but I would hate to see what you would say if you've been part of it. And Bernard, I'm going to need your help. It's difficult to continue to operate within a framework that, in many ways, at least in my view, keeps leading us away from a more clear picture of what is inherently a set of unknowns. And what I mean by that is the whole notion of talking about, and I appreciate Steve's comments about broad strokes, but the whole notion of we are living beyond our means, we will need to have certain balances redressed. That entire way of talking about an economy, while familiar and perhaps comforting to suggest that there is this economic community that is parallel with a nation state, strikes me as something that is increasingly untrue, even though our framework is still that. Every economic framework and every way in which we have of trying to understand economies is a fairly recent derivation based on the idea that the nation state is the unit that has to be in balance. And that all began in the late 19th century and the early 20th century as people started collecting a lot of data and trying to figure out these things, and there have been economic writings beforehand. And much of our sense of what is healthy and unhealthy is still predicated very much on how these 180 or 205 or whatever the number of nations in the world today, how they relate to each other as units, in balance or not in balance with each other. That's going to remain true for a while because to some degree that consciousness dictates policy, it dictates our analysis. There is another system emerging that has either very little regard for or very little reference to the nation state, and which is functioning in its own particular terms, although again, I don't think we can fully measure those. Things like living beyond means, the reality is as long as one can finance debt, you're not living beyond means. And clearly there are tens of millions of people in any given moment who are living beyond their means, i.e. have taken on or been allowed to or extended credit that they simply cannot afford. And at the same time, millions of others are either not taking on that credit or taking on credit they can afford. No one knows the limits of debt as to what is sustainable and balanced way. And I suppose the prudent argument is that as well, given that there is clearly some breaking point where too much debt is going to crash the system, you ought to avoid getting to that point. But you can take that much too far, just as one can say to all of us, well, we live in a world full of contagion, so the best course of action is to seal yourself in a plastic bubble and not expose yourself to any of those problems, because eventually if you do, you get sick. We don't really know the breaking point. We can go through the last 30 years of articles and economists' warnings about too much debt, crushing under the weight of our own debt, and none of that limit has proved to be quite what we thought, which isn't to say that there aren't huge inefficiencies along the way. And all this is by way of saying that there has been, and this gets to what Bernard was pointing to, increasing stability within a global economic system over the past 50 years. That is unequivocal. I mean, even in our worst case scenarios, we're not talking about a 1933 situation where 25% of the U.S. workforce was out of work, where 500 banks fail, and you have an economy coming to a halt. And remember, I mean, before the 1970s, or well into the 1970s and early 1980s, those kind of economic contractions, both domestically and globally, were par for the course. And we are living with a level of kind of systemic stability that masks a huge amount of individual variability and volatility that could affect tens of millions of people at any given time. But I think the nature of the argument really needs to move away from the kind of optimist, pessimist, binary, is it good, is it bad, and needs by necessity to become more complicated if we're going to adequately and accurately deal with what's going on.
David Hale?
I want to expand a little bit on Zachary's initial comments about how we have multiple economies. The first point I'd make is I think the current global economy has the most benign conditions that mankind has known since the 3rd century AD. This year, 120 countries will have a growth rate over 4%. And there are many emerging market countries where the growth rates will be 2 or 3 times as high. China's 11 or 12, India's 9 or 10, Russia is 7. Africa and Latin America, because of high commodity prices, are also 6 or 7. The African growth rate today is the best in 50 years.
What was the growth rate in 300 AD, just for comparison?
The answer is that was the most benign time mankind did before this period. And the rate of output growth in that period of human history was probably 2 or 3%, because productivity gains weren't that large. But it was broad, and there was not any warfare going on. We had a stable Roman Empire. In any case, just to continue, this in turn has created a great opportunity for America. This year, our export growth is running at 13 and 14%. Because with the cheap dollar and all of this growth outside America, we have many, many export opportunities. The great tragedy is the Democratic Party in this country has now embraced protectionism at the very time that we have the best opportunities for export-led growth. In fact, we're in the midst of a great change in the global balance of power. In the year 2000, the consumer spending of the world's top 17 emerging market countries, China, India, Mexico, Russia, Poland, was 48% of U.S. consumer spending. This year, it's 70%. In those countries, consumer spending is growing by 15% per annum. Here, it's growing by 4 or 5%. So within 10 years, the emerging market countries, the 17 big ones, will have more consumer spending than America. And that's an extraordinary achievement. Because in the decade 1995 to 2005, it was the American consumer alone who gave us 55% of global consumer spending. This is a very, very profound change. Now, the other important development is that many of these emerging market countries are now running huge current account surpluses. China's $400 billion. Japan's $200 billion. The Gulf countries, $300 or $400 billion. Huge surpluses, they got to find a place to go. Where will the money go? Well, there's no doubt a lot of it came here over the last 5 or 6 years to finance our consumption boom and our housing market. We've had talk today about infrastructure. What we need now to access this money in a more intelligent and productive way is to privatize our infrastructure. There's now billions of dollars piling up in infrastructure funds in Europe, Australia, the Middle East, looking for places to go. And the obvious targets are infrastructure in India, in China, in Malaysia, in developing countries. But there's no reason why it wouldn't come here if we had a framework for people to invest in our infrastructure. We've begun to do it. 3 years ago, the city of Chicago sold one of its roads to Macquarie Bank of Australia. The state of Indiana then sold its whole road also to Macquarie Bank. These are the first examples of privatization. But if we were to do this in a meaningful and significant way, we could attract, I think, tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, looking out 5 or 10 years, to revitalize our infrastructure. But we have to have a new framework for ownership and for sharing this with the rest of the world. And if we do, the Steve Schwarzman could go from buying Sam Zell's real estate empire and breaking it up, buying manufacturing companies, laying off all the workers, to buying the Brooklyn Bridge and selling to Dubai. That, I think, would be a great final conclusion for Steve Schwarzman's career.
Yeah, sovereign wealth fund topic get even broader. Jamie Galbraith.
Well, Zach, when I said I was going to read it directly, I don't think I said I was going to read it.
Yeah. No, you didn't say that. I just stuck that in for rhetorical.
Take advantage of my position. But I am going to back you up at this point, because I think you're exactly right on the question of living beyond means. I don't think the position of the United States in the world economy, that our position as banker, prior reserves, can be disentangled from our trade position. Nor should we want to. Nor would it be good for the world system. We provide a number of services to the world system, and the stability of that system will be best served by our continuing to do so. So I think from that point of view, we are going to run a current account deficit, and we are going to run a corresponding deficit in the private sector, which may be in the public sector or maybe in the private sector, will partly be in both. What we're seeing now, and what we should be fostering, and I'll back you up on the second point, is a transition from a heavy reliance on one particular sector of the U.S. economy as a motor for growth. That is to say, the housing sector and the financial capitalization of home equity to finance consumption, to something else. Because I think Steve's right, we cannot avoid the adjustment that's going to occur. Nor would it be a good idea to ask the Federal Reserve to reverse financial conditions and try to keep the housing bubble going. First of all, it wouldn't work. We've overinvested in that sector. There is an excess capacity. Prices are going to come down. So lowering interest rates are not going to overcome the downward pressure of prices on asset valuation and creditworthiness in that sector. We're going to have to come up with something else. And that's why, again, it seems to me, it is absolutely vital to start thinking about what that something else should be. It's going to have to be something in which it seems to me the public, just like the technology boom, in which work done, initiated in the public sector, sparked by the public sector, generates new developments in the private economy. And I would like to see that. It seems to me it would be good from the standpoint of the social welfare of the population of the United States to have that work start by the kind of public investment and infrastructure effort that we've been describing. Because that would provide the basis for the development of an entirely new private initiative, particularly in the areas of energy transformation that we need to have occur. And I would, just a final point, I would like to see the division between public and private occur along those lines, rather than along the lines of privatization of public assets and infrastructure. The problem I have with that, I mean, see the experience of the British trains, for example, is that you simply don't get out of the private owners the kind of maintenance and responsiveness to customers that you ought to have, and that a responsive, publicly owned, municipally owned, state-owned system ought to provide. So I'm in favor of keeping the infrastructure in public hands, but using that as a catalyst for a lot of private sector development, which would be very much in the tradition of private property.
Thank you, Jamie and Steve.
Just a small point. Let's be careful not to assume that we're not spending any money, and the government isn't, let's start with that, not spending any money on the kinds of things that led to the internet, for example. When the government spent the things, it was mostly, I think, the Defense Department, that spent the money for that, they didn't know it was going to be, result in the iPod, or the iPhone, rather. They didn't know that. And we do spend as much money today, or almost as much money today, on that stuff as we did back then when it led to the internet. So the idea that we're not spending anything there is false. Whether we should spend more, okay, you can have a debate, but let's not have this conversation as if somehow the government isn't spending that money anymore. Because we are. We may be misspending too much of it, but even President Bush has announced a big initiative on spending on energy. I think it's one of the few things that both parties agree on, that we ought to be doing a crash course on crash investment in new energy and energy infrastructure. And we somewhat disagree about which kinds of energy, but anyway, we're pretty much in agreement with that. That's the one thing we agree on in this country, so we got to ride that way. But we are not spending on this stuff. We are spending.
The only caveat I would add, because I look at these numbers and used to work for Senator Bingaman, who's one of his chief causes is looking at sort of basic R&D investment, which I look at as part of infrastructure, is if you look at private sector investment in basic R&D, it's really plummeted over years. So that's on the private side of the equation of the federal. And the federal is much more in the applied area rather than the basic today, which is again another function. So the content and character of the kind of investment that you're sharing, Steve, is actually different than, say, the profile a decade ago, and there may be consequences to the different side of that.
Well, to some respect, the government has shifted from basic to applied because it wants to get more internets. If that may have been a mistake, but that was the idea, was to get more internet.
It's also true that a lot of the spending on R&D that's done in the private sector has also gone offshore in a way that isn't traceable to immediate spending. So there's an awful lot of global R&D going on that is probably well in excess, but it shows up as a shrinkage because it's taking place elsewhere, being spent by other entities. The same thing in terms of higher education. A problem for the United States, if we perceive that we, as an economic national unit, need to have preeminence, not necessarily a problem for a global innovation around products and services and improving life.
Thank you very much. I think it's been a very rich discussion. I want to open the floor. We've got C-SPAN would like to get to you with a microphone. Our staff will go around. I'm going to ask you to identify yourself and ask one of the three questions that you'd like to pose. And please don't ask the entire panel a response so that we can get everyone as many people involved. But we'll start with Jed, and I'll move around. So.
Jed Schilling, and I have one quick comment and a question. The comment is this Australian company bought the Dulles Toll Road, not the Dulles Toll Road, the Greenway, and charges by far the highest tariff in the country, between 30 cents and $3 a mile, depending on whether you get off at the last exit or the first exit, and is not guaranteed to reinvest any of that money in this country. So I think privatizing public natural monopolies is not the best way to go unless they're more adequately controlled. My question is, we talked a lot about the credit crunch from the subprime mortgage market, which is indeed large, 1.3 trillion. I'd like to know how much additional credit demand use crunch is coming from the hedge funds who are highly leveraged and borrow extensive amounts of money to gamble in the financial markets, and how much is going to the private equity firms which are buying existing firms and not investing in new capital, and how much is it related to the carry trade out of Japan, which is just based on different interest rates, and how much does that contribute to the credit crunch?
Thank you. Let me ask Zach and David to comment quickly.
Yeah, on the private equity question, and again, it's hard to know with numbers. Clearly, private equity groups have found it's much harder and probably will be much harder for them to do deals because they depend on large amounts of bank financing and that's certainly one of the reasons why these sovereign wealth funds are probably going to assume a lot of prominence because they don't need the credit. It's also why a lot of corporations are probably going to start doing deals again because they have a lot of cash on their balance sheets. Hedge funds, it's a little more difficult to really gauge because it's true that a lot of prime brokerage desks at these very same institutions extended huge amounts of credit for them, as you put it, to gamble, as they like to put it, to make reasoned and rational calculations about their investment decisions. You know, it's hard to know which will be affected in which way because it's not a very transparent industry by design, and it's not as if anyone's really going to publicly state one way or the other whether or not they've suddenly found that their credit is cut off. And David may have some more insight to that.
Well, the hedge funds, we probably won't know that because the losses for several more months because they value these securities with models, not market prices. Until their accountants make them market in a more effective way, we just won't know. But when Bear Stearns' two funds went bankrupt back in June, the problem was very simply leverage. They were leveraged 20 times. As even a small price decline, 5 or 10% will wipe you out when you're leveraged 20 times. And they were. And they claimed they were high-grade securities, but the high-grade securities were calling in price too. Not as much as the low-grade securities, but enough to wipe them out. The private equity business is dead in the next 6 or 9 months. It'll come back at some point, and right now the funding for it has basically gone away. There's still billions of dollars in private equity funds that are trying to do deals, but these guys like to do it with leverage to enhance their rate of return, and they've lost access to leverage for the next several months. But M&A activity will continue. As Zachary said, corporations do have liquidity, they have cash. Right now, this is one of the biggest takeover bids in corporate history. A bid out of Melbourne, from DHT, broken no proprietary, for RTZ, the big British mining company. That takeover bid is worth $150 billion. That is awesome by any historical standard. You asked about the yen carry trade. It has two dimensions. Part of it is Japanese retail investors escaping 50 basis points money market yields by buying foreign securities. And over the last couple of years, they've exported $600 billion into other countries' bond markets, Australia, New Zealand, here, Europe, all over. And that will continue, because with Japan still experiencing inflation, interest rates will be less than 1% there for the next couple of years. The other dimension to it is the hedge funds, borrowing yen by other countries' asset finance. That was huge 6 months ago, but because we've now had 5 months of volatility, turmoil, falling prices, the hedge funds have greatly reduced their leverage. And that has, since July, caused a big rally in the yen, from 121 in June to 107, 108 this week. And that will continue for the time being. But when people figure out Japanese yields can be less than 1% for 2 or 3 years, I do think at some point next year, when things have stabilized, the yen carry trade will come back, and the yen will fall back to 120, 125, 130.
I have found, by the way, if you want to sound intelligent at a cocktail party about why things are happening the way they are, just say yen carry trade.
Let me go right here.
I'm Judd Harriet. I'm a documentary filmmaker and an economist. My question relates to the securitization of the subprime mortgages, and specifically the role of the rating agencies. Did they fail?
Yes.
What could they have done, and what will be their role in any future bubbles?
It's interesting, and I want to piggyback on this. Did the rating agencies fail? And reflecting, I just got back from China at a McKinsey-sponsored conference, and I have McKinsey pins here. I don't think I'm violating the deal of not attributing issues. But one of the issues that came up was the view that many in the world had that America had exported poison financial products to the rest of the world. And I was in China, of course, which is still reeling from our accusations that they were exporting lead-based products and whatnot to us. But I think it's a very interesting point that the rating agencies fail, but also to turn to Simon, how is the world looking at this? You went out of your way to show that many of these issues are not, in fact, American, that you see many of the patterns globally. And some of you said that the subprime problem is a credit problem, not a subprime problem. But there is, I think, that you might get a different feel elsewhere. So both the rating agency question and the question of how is the international system looking at us today, and financial derivatives, instruments, the innovative side of the financial sector. Right, and he legitimately points the finger. Simon?
I'll speak to the, sound like David wanted to take credit for it. Let me speak to the international system reaction question. I think that's a huge issue right now. I think the ability of the US to sustain its credit account, as James said, is absolutely reliant on our ability to attract capital. And we've had a variety of, I think, very interesting proposals floated here for different things you could sell to foreigners, basically. So, we'll take a vote perhaps at the end of the day. What do you want to sell? But you've got to sell something like that. You've got to sell something. If you want to run a credit account, that's right. That's not a matter of economics and algorithm. And at the moment, the private, what we're seeing in the data, which are quite imperfect, and I must say data don't get better, they get worse every day for various reasons. What we're seeing is the private sector around the world is a little less inclined to come into the US right now. And they are worried, Poison's point is a little but they're worried about, everybody's worried about not understanding what is on offer in the US and not feeling comfortable. So they're waiting, they're still on the sidelines. And as Zach said, capital goes where capital wants right now. Now, there's a lot of capital outside the US needs to find a home somewhere. A lot of it's going to Europe right now. A lot of it's going to the emerging market. We do think that central banks are continuing to accumulate gold. And we do see US interest rates, Treasury interest rates coming down because someone is buying US Treasuries, and that includes foreigners, and it's probably more in the public sector. We also know that these public sectors, large holdings of reserves of sovereign wealth funds, somewhat familiar, are interested in some securities in diversifying their portfolios around the world, which is another way of saying they want to get out of dollars at some point. I don't think they want to do anything, but they will do anything precipitate. I think they're long-term investors and they care a lot about stability of the system. But I think there is going to be pressure there. And I feel and my colleagues feel that it will be hard for the US to continue to sustain a current account at this level or at recent levels. We do think the US can sustain a current account deficit, and we do not sustain a deficit at this level. We do think that we can sustain a deficit, but not at this level. We do think that that's why depreciation, modest further depreciation will always be helpful because you still, if you run an ADX at all, you're still going to have to sell something to non-US people. I think it's exactly what they're sold. Very interesting question.
Thank you, David. On credit agencies.
Well, it's very simple. Credit agencies have a major conflict of interest. The fees they got for creating these structured debt products, like CDOs, that incorporate the subprime loans, the fees on that were 3 times as high as the fees for traditional bond ratings. So the rating agencies collaborated very closely with Wall Street brokerage houses in the securitization process. And they gave ratings that made it very easy to sell the paper to investment institutions all over the world. So they're guilty, I think, of the conflict of interest they fail to acknowledge. Now, they'll say in their self-defense, because I've discussed it with them, that they could not imagine a decline in U.S. house prices. What's about to happen in the U.S. in the next 12 months is unprecedented since 1933. There has not been a decline in our national house price index since the Great Depression. We've had many regional recessions. Los Angeles in 1992, Houston in 1986, but never has been a national house price decline. And the best guess right now at Fannie Mae is that house prices will fall by 10%. Goldman Sachs came out with a report 3 days ago saying maybe 20%. We don't know. But when you have those kinds of losses, then the odds of default increase quite dramatically because people have negative equity. If they've got negative equity, it's just very easy to walk away and give the keys to the house back to your bank. In this country, we don't punish people who default. We live in other countries like Canada, Australia, and they go after you. But here, you just walk away. The only risk you have when you default is you get a 1099. Right? It takes your house, it sells it. The difference between the value of the house, the value of your mortgage, could be for you classified as a capital gain. So you get a 1099, you get a pay income tax. That's the only liability you have in this country with default.
Or not. Bush has his way.
Or we're trying to get rid of that.
Explain that a little bit, Steve.
So the proposal actually has bipartisan support that people who do walk away don't get a 1099.
That's right. That proposal, the president will probably happen. Because it will be 4 million people going through foreclosure who will get a 1099 having defaulted.
Let's move to right here.
My name is Greg Borowski, and I would like to question one thing about the knowledge economy. Less than 10 years ago, oil was at $11 a barrel, and May '99, The Economist wrote that it was heading towards $5 a barrel. At this moment, the El Salvadorian working outside of El Salvador earn themselves gross more than the national income of El Salvador. So actually you have 2 El Salvadors at least in the world. So we have no way of measuring what's going on in the world. In circumstances like this, blaming some credit rating agencies, shouldn't you be blaming those who empowered the credit rating agencies to take decisions?
Thank you. David, want to expand?
Well, we've had the tradition of the government basically recognizing 3 major rating agencies. There are others out there, much smaller, don't get as much attention. So there is competition, but historically we've given the greatest respect and the greatest credibility to 3 major agencies, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. And when regulators go in and look at securities and so on, those are the ones that tend to rely. Perhaps because of this crisis, we will now change that and recognize other agencies, smaller ones that maybe were more maverick, more independent, offer better judgments. The response is still unclear. Right now, there's lots of investigations going on at this issue at the European Union level, with the SEC, and we haven't seen the full consequences yet. You probably won't know for 9 to 12 more months.
David, you accused the credit agencies of corruption in a way, which is interesting, by looking at this disparity in fees, which was something that could be known at some point. I think one interesting question is, are there other arenas of unseen problems in the future based upon fee disparities that you could identify today to anticipate tomorrow's next problem or next scandal? Has anyone looked at that question of how the incentives in the credit rating business are organized today, so rather than commenting after the fact that you could get some forward insights?
You could start with the investment bank.
Yeah, and they don't, that's a big number. Any securitized package of loans, I mean, there's certainly going to be issues about credit card loans and consumer credit card loans and how those are blended for similar reasons. It's a lot easier to release that. Although the author of the Economist article recently said that it is heading to $5, so it's taking a very serious
I think what we're very special is how far securitization has gone in this country. It hasn't happened elsewhere in the world on this scale. We've had in the last 5 years great housing inflation in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Spain, also Ireland, Italy recently, but they haven't had the problem we've had with non-performing loans with that because it wasn't securitized. The bank made the loan, the bank kept it. And here, it was sold by Wall Street to a wide range of investors all over the world. We thought that was very good for you. This helped to broaden home ownership. America's home ownership ratio grew from 65% 5 years ago to 69% last year. I think it'll go back to 65% over the next 3 or 4 years because of this crisis and the way it plays out. But the fact is, we're unique in having had this kind of securitization. It's because Wall Street had a good incentive. They make a lot of money securitizing. There's new securities you can sell, and there are fees linked to doing that. And this winter, there'll be hundreds of people, if not thousands of people on Wall Street getting laid off because the market for these securitized products has now effectively gone away.
Yes, sir.
Ron Davis from the State Department, and this is probably the mostly for David Hale. If you, as regulators of the mortgage industry and the banks, had basically done their job, could this crisis been avoided, and where do we go from here? Do we go back to the system we had that worked for many, many years that you just gave a little rundown on, where the banks held the mortgages?
Well, we had a problem developed over the last 5 years. A year ago, 18 months ago, a lot of this lending in the subprime sector was being done by non-banks. We had a whole bunch of new intermediaries like New Century Financial, which at one point had a $40 billion balance sheet, generating subprime loans. Because they weren't a bank, they weren't being regulated, either by state or federal organizations. And so we had a kind of gap in the system. I think as a consequence of this crisis, there'll be more attempts at regulation and trying to anticipate this kind of problem. The new danger is that Congressman Frank has a bill going through right now that could, I think, shut down a lot of the housing market for many people. He wants to basically make it possible that if the bank makes a bad loan, to be liable for the bad loan. So if you go in default, you're not in trouble, the bank's in trouble, because your lawyers can sue the bank for having made a bad loan to you. What this means is that he's opened up mortgage lending to the tort bar, tort lawyers, and if they do that, I can tell you in 3 years' time, a quarter of the American people will not qualify for a mortgage under any circumstances, because they just won't have the wealth and the income to qualify. Because banks will be terrified to make a loan to anybody who's vulnerable to unemployment, with income loss, be it divorce, be it health, who knows what. It might jeopardize that loan. So the congressional response to this could be catastrophic. And we just don't know. The bill hasn't passed yet, it's going, and we'll have to watch and see what happens.
Let me pose a side question to Jamie and to Steve Perlstein. David Hale and Laura Tyson and I were together in India just recently at a very interesting conference. And one of the comments that Laura Tyson made was similar to this gentleman's point, is that there's been so much innovation, diversification of financial instruments, that regulators are simply now, we're unaware of the various kinds of collisions, convulsions, and outcomes from a lot of the financial behavior of a very complex interactive system. And I think she made the case that we may be at a point where we're just so far behind in regulatory ability to understand that. And if that's true, what do you do about it? One, you assume that that's true, Jamie, and two, what do you do about it if, in fact, we've got Ben Bernanke calling Hank Paulson 85 times over a period of time to understand how a market is working? Is that not, I mean, obviously he's not going to be Secretary of the Treasury because he was engaged as a private sector player, innovating in ways that the government may or may not have its head around. I'm sorry, sir.
I don't know whether you know that that's why we can't.
Well, we may not.
There are many millions of American households who took out these mortgages, and although it can be fairly said that they should not have been expected to do that, and do not understand fully what they were doing. There's something, I think, intrinsically abusive about a mortgage lender going to a relatively low-income household and offering them a rate which is geared to reset 2 or 3 years down the road on the basis of interest rate projections that the mortgage lender has a very strong expectation that those rates are going to be higher 3 years down the road. But the household's got no idea. The household's in no basis to judge whether the present interest rate climate is normal or abnormal. Not part of their experience. It's asking them to make a prudent speculation and something for which they use. So there's something intrinsically abusive about that. Dealing with it one way or another, and Barney Frank's legislation is one possibility, is going to, I think, have to be part of the solution to this problem. Down the road, one suggestion which has been mentioned by Elizabeth Warren at Harvard Law School is the creation of something that we call a financial products safety commission. That would, in some sense, vet the kinds of instruments that are available to households and make some judgments again that low-income households are simply not in a position to make. Provide a buffer, the kind of buffer that we do for electrical appliances, for toys, we should be doing, and we did until the CSPCs. And in a sense, make this market one which ordinary consumers would have to function. That's not the case today.
Thank you, Steve.
Back in 2005, Alan Greenspan told people in a public speech that you guys had variable rate mortgage, absolutely, take advantage of low interest rates. I mean, the chairman of the Federal Reserve was actually encouraging this move 2.5 years ago.
Steve, you have a question?
No, I don't. Okay.
Question. Yes, right there.
Tom Kennedy. With reference to a comment Zachary Karabell made earlier, I think you said that you hoped that people who were in difficult credit situations, essentially people who couldn't afford it, weren't spending $500 on an iPhone. I'm wondering to what extent do you think the fact that it seems that they are spending $500 on an iPhone is part of the problem and maybe a symptom of a wider living beyond our means situation?
You know, again, it gets back to there are clearly and have been and will continue to be millions of people who make inaccurate estimations of their own capacity to pay for debt that they take on, which in no way, I think, precludes what Jamie Galbraith was saying in that we in multiple ways make decisions based on the greater good to limit the choice that individuals have based on a whole variety of factors, whether it's their ability to take that on or not. And I think in a lot of ways that's entirely the right approach and will be the approach around this. Getting that right is devilishly difficult. But I think I would still go back to the fact that there are very different tranches of this economy. And one of the bubbles we haven't talked about, but which is clearly going to be part of the political dialogue, is essentially the wealth bubble, which is global and in no way, I think, in immediate danger of popping. Many others will, but not that one. And what that means is that in this country alone, 2 or 3 million people spend more on the upper end of the income spectrum than 100 million other people at the lower end of the spectrum. And those are extraordinary numbers and are probably going to become more extraordinary. So I certainly take the point that at any given set of people, some may or may not be making particularly wise or good allocations of the cash that they have. The reality is that there are very disparate worlds here, and they bear very little reference to each other, and occasionally they intercede and feed on each other's consciousness. But that 2 million people who are spending more than 100 million others are living in a very different economic universe than most people are, and that further complicates this notion of what economy are we talking about.
Steve, one last quick question, Merrill.
Hi, I want to just use some of David Hale's, Merrill Guzman with the Center for Science and the Public Interest, although I used to be a member of the Economic Writers Guild. So, using some of your worst case projections, I'm really having a hard time getting my hand around the severity of this crisis, because if we take 1.3 trillion and we talk about 20-25% default rate, we're talking about maybe 300 billion. Well, that's lesser numbers than we talked about in the savings and loans crisis 15 years ago. And in nominal terms, that's not all that different. And the other thing that I would like to just comment on quickly and just get your comment on is sort of, Jamie, your idea that this is going to be very broad-based. You know, I read the press pretty closely, and one of the things that's amazed me throughout all of this is how little coverage there's been about this sort of devastation happening in neighborhoods. And maybe it's because the financial press in New York and Washington, places where our homes could go down 20% in value, and you'd only be up 100% over 10 years ago. But it wouldn't matter a whole lot. And I don't know if it seems to me that this crisis is playing out again, as it has so often in the last couple of decades, in targeted areas rather than ultimately broad-based in the economy.
So Marilyn is challenging the cynicism. So quick comments from any of you.
Actually, the New York Times has been writing articles in the last 3 months about the neighborhood profile of subprime lending. There's a big story just 4 or 5 weeks ago about how in low-income white neighborhoods, the ratio of subprime loans to mortgages was 2 or 3%, but 10 miles away in a neighborhood with the same income, but largely black, it was 40% subprime lending. This has been documented, been written about quite extensively. We know similar neighborhoods, not just in New York, but in Detroit and Cleveland, with the same pattern happening. A heavy concentration of subprime lending with racial minorities and other groups not being as severely affected. So you're right about the size of the loss. $200 billion is not huge for the U.S. economy. It was ironic that we had days back in July and August when the stock market capitalization fell by $2 trillion because of fear about a $200 billion loss. The problem is we don't know who has the loss. It's scattered through all these securities, which are widely held by hedge funds, insurance companies, banks, and so it's just created lots of uncertainty. As you saw in this chart at the very beginning, bank stocks around the world have fallen by 25 to 30% because of this uncertainty. Simon?
If it's only a credit crunch, then the exact size, we don't know yet, but the sensible response is the Fed's credit interest rates, and there's some other automatic stabilizing economy that those are going to help. The problem is there's a confluence of the credit problems and inflationary pressure, for example, from oil prices. Then it's very hard for central banks to cut interest rates in a way that I think is actually implicit in everything we've been saying here. We're expecting the Fed to make sensible responses as the economy slows down. You can't do that if there's pressure on inflation. Inflationary expectations really become unanchored, to use that terminology. So I think it's not a one shot. If the potential confluence of a 21st century, very new version of financial problems with an old-fashioned 1970s oil price shock. Those two things to come together, and you potentially have something you might think of
You know, on that, and Steve was actually quite right about this. This isn't really a housing. The housing market is not the thing that's producing the level of potential crisis. It's the credit and the system that grew up around that, and that's absolutely the right point. There was a time in the early part of the 20th to the late 19th century where the whole notion of a dollar bill, you know, a piece of paper to represent value and money, was an incredibly insecure phenomenon. That, you know, there's no gold or silver that was immediately redeemable to back it up. And I think in the greater scheme of things, which is no comfort to the present tense that we all live in, some of the adjustments, whether securitization or derivatives, or the continued removal of this economic system from anything notably tangible underneath it, it does develop its own stability because people have trust and faith. And a lot of the stuff that's being marked down in the credit world is marked down because of the fear of the worst case scenario rather than what these things are actually going to be worth at any given time. And by the way, one thing we can absolutely learn from this crisis is that anybody who calls themselves level 3, given what happened in the internet boom and given the pricing now, should absolutely not attract your capital. So, you know, we are developing a different kind of system, but these things don't develop without huge amounts of uncertainty and panic. And again, that's a really big picture statement. It has very little bearing on the problems of the moment, but I think, you know, if we look back at this in 30 or 40 years, that's part of what we will come to see in the clarity of 2020 hindsight.
Quick comment, Mr. Referee?
Well, we shall see.
Historically,
housing has played a very important role in leading the business activities. Off that chart on that at the beginning of this panel. And the second point I make is that this crisis is still unfolding. A great many of the resets that are programmed that are going to happen haven't happened yet. A great many more people will be kicked into this process. And then to come back to the point I made earlier, it will affect people who don't have subprime loans. It will affect the housing values of people who are ordinary mortgages or using their homes for home equity loans. So the extent to which this can take over into the system that we've used to finance for the last 10 years is still maybe it will not turn out to be such a big deal, but my instinct is to be worried at this stage.
Finally, Steve Fulton.
Well, anything else to add other than credit card? All the banks are saying, you know, those charges are going up too, and they're just beginning to see it. So, that's another source of, that's another little credit bubble, which is the credit card bubble. Sorry, not
Just to clarify for the C-SPAN viewers, we're talking about the charges for credit card firms.
No, we're talking about the fact that the charge-offs, that is the bad debt,
Right.
that the banks are now reporting, not necessarily from bad or subprime borrowers or risky borrowers, but from all borrowers are going up. And they've all warned that it's going up and they don't know how high it's going up. So that's another, again, that's another bubble to watch in the coming years.
Interesting. Well, as our panel unwires himself, please give this great panel a round of applause.